Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the multivocal democratic spirit of our literary tradition a vital part of the culture. A special welcome to our fellows and members who support our nonprofit mission. Tonight's program honors a 20th century American master, a visionary teller of tales who took speculative fiction from the pulp magazines to the center of American literary culture. Ray Bradbury remains, more than a decade after his death, an enduring and pervasive influence on writers who've come after. His work is collected in 2 volumes in the Library of America series, available singly or as a deluxe boxed edition. Novels and story cycles, and The Illustrated Man, The October Country, and Other Stories. Both are edited by Jonathan Eller, who joins us tonight. Volume 2 is published, and Volume 1 is kept permanently in print by gifts from John Logan, thanks to whose generosity they will stand as lasting testimony to Bradbury's towering contributions to American writing. And our producers will drop links to more information about the books in the chat. Information on supporting or permanently endowing volumes in the Library of America series can be found at loa.org/support. Special thanks to our promotional partners for this program, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, Locust Magazine, the Ray Bradbury Center at Indiana University, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association, and Tor.com. Margaret Atwood has confessed, "I was warped early by Ray Bradbury." It's an experience familiar to many readers and to many writers, some of whom we'll hear from shortly. What is it about Bradbury's unique blend of science fiction, dark fantasy, mystery, suspense, nostalgia, and the macabre that makes his work such an inescapable presence? What do his stories tell us now, when intervening decades have intensified aspects of the modern world that provoked him, encroaching authoritarianism, intolerance, conformity, rapaciousness, and technology as distraction? Are we any closer to answering the question at the heart of much of his writing? How to live and act wisely, humanely, and without fear in the face of the new and strange and different, whether here on Earth or on some future faraway planet. To explore these and other questions, we're very fortunate to be joined by a very distinguished panel. Author of 29 novels and story collections, Connie Willis has won more major science fiction awards than any other writer, including 7 Nebulas, 11 Hugos, and 9 Locus Awards. Her new novel, The Road to Roswell, was published last month. For Library of America, she has edited a collection of American Christmas stories, and her story, Daisy in the Sun, is published in the Library of America collection, The Future is Female, Classic Science Fiction Stories by Women from the 1970s. Like Ray Bradbury, Kelly Link draws on science fiction, mystery, horror, and realistic fiction in her acclaimed short stories. Her work has been honored with many awards, and she received a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2018. Her brilliant story, Stone Animals, appears in Library of America's American Fantastic Tales, Terror and the Uncanny from the 1940s to Now, edited by Peter Straub. Her most recent book is White Cat, Black Dog, a collection of stories published this past March. Jonathan Eller, editor of the Library of America Bradbury edition, is author of the definitive 3-volume Ray Bradbury biography and served as general editor of the collected stories of Ray Bradbury and the New Bradbury Review. He is Chancellor's Professor of English Emeritus at Indiana University and co-founder of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, which he directed for a decade until his retirement in 2021. Our moderator, Gary K. Wolfe, is Emeritus Professor of Humanities in Roosevelt University's Evelyn T. Stone College of Professional Studies and a preeminent authority on science fiction and fantasy. The many books he's written and edited include a biography of Harlan Ellison, and for Library of America, 2 definitive 2-volume collections, American Science Fiction, 9 classic novels of the 1950s, and 8 classic novels of the 1960s. We invite your questions and comments. The Q&A button is on your menu bar. Please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome our moderator, Gary Wolfe.
Hello, and thank you, Max. This has been a wonderful preparation, thinking about talking with all of these knowledgeable people. And obviously, we all have the same questions, I think, about Bradbury when we look at him as adults. And that is, what started us all down the Bradbury path? What was it that first attracted you to Bradbury, whether you were a kid or an adult? And I'm going to start with Connie Willis, whose new novel, The Road to Roswell, is dedicated to Ray Bradbury and a handful of other influential science fiction readers that you, Connie, say shaped your imagination. And as a piece of almost meaningless trivia, I discovered from the chronology in the back of one of the Library of America volumes that Ray Bradbury, at the age of 6, lived in Roswell for a while, which I think is fascinating but meaningless. But Connie, how did you discover Ray Bradbury, and what did he do to you?
Well, it may not be meaningless. I mean, maybe the whole Roswell thing was influenced by Ray Bradbury. Who knows? Just one second. Courtney, my internet is unstable, it says. So, okay. We're going to go for it here.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. When I started reading science fiction with whatever was in the library was had it had on the spine of the book a spaceship, a rocket ship, and then a little atom symbol. So I just followed around the library looking for those things. And in fact, one of the first people, being a bee, I discovered was Ray Bradbury, and instantly fell in love with him. Who knows? I mean, he read, even at the time, totally differently from any other writer. You would never mistake a Bradbury story. And I have no idea what the first story I read was. I know what my favorites are. I think what my favorites were, and I mean, what my first encounter was, and I don't know, because they've all blurred together in a sort of, this is a Bradbury story, and because I read as much of him as I possibly could. But I would say that possibly one of the first I read was The Golden Apples of the Sun, which is definitely unlike any other science fiction that was being written at the time. It was lyrical, it was elegant, and it was a kind of approach to science and space that I wasn't seeing anywhere else.
I think one of the questions that one of the things that comes up whenever we talk about this is the style. The fact here was somebody paying attention to language, which a lot of science fiction writers were not doing at that period. Was that your experience, Kelly?
I think that I began reading Bradbury at a point where I was not paying much attention to how language worked. I just knew if I liked something or if I didn't. I found an old anthology of Golden Age science fiction, and I had put little stars in pencil. I had a system for marking the ones that I thought were particularly good, but even at that point, I don't think that I thought, well, that's beautifully written or that's not. It was just, I really, really like this. So like Connie, I had forgotten those stickers on the back with the rocket ships or with the little orbit planet. But I would look for those. A lot of the science fiction in the libraries was in spinner racks. And I'm pretty sure that the first Bradbury collection that I read in its entirety was The Illustrated Man. Yeah. But I loved short stories, so any anthology I would pick up. I read a lot of Joan Kahn anthologies, and most of those would have at least one Ray Bradbury story in them. And it took me a while to realize that stories had authors. I loved stories, but I paid no attention to who had written them. I think because they were in anthologies. And so it took me a while to think, oh, I should go look for a whole book by that person. They might have a whole book up there. But The Illustrated Man is the first one that I remember reading, and I was fascinated by the frame device, by the fact that this is an encounter with somebody whose tattoos begin to tell stories. And I just loved it. I loved that blend of fantasy and science fiction in her. And there's nobody like him.
John, you've spent most of your career with Bradbury. So is it possible, with all you know about him, that you can remember when you discovered him?
Yes, there is a continuum there for me that starts in about 1962. I went to the school library, and I, like Connie, I was attracted, and also Kelly, I was attracted to the little logo with the rocket, the book going around it. The first one that I grabbed in 1962 was The Golden Apples of the Sun.
Okay.
And when I got to the title story at the end, it just wowed me. There we have the most unscientific science fiction story that's still famous today. How do you go to the sun to grab the golden apples of the sun, the fusion of the sun? Because that is the secret to unlimited energy someday. And the ship is built near absolute zero environment inside. And they go to the sun in their little ship, and they're able to scoop those golden apples and come back to Earth. Absolutely unscientific,
Yes.
but I was captured by it because Bradbury's science fiction wasn't the kind of science fiction that we really would consider mainstream science fiction. But Bradbury was a guy who helped bring science fiction into the literary mainstream. That sense of wonderment in his science fiction stories is there, the eeriness, the sense of aloneness and overcoming the challenges of alienness in the environment. They just made me want to read more, and I did read more. Then when I spent 20 years in the Air Force beginning in 1973, and I realized then that all of Ray Bradbury's dreams of the space age had become our dreams too. And I began to see, and you know, if you talk to astronomers, astrophysicists, astronauts, aerospace scientists, and engineers, a lot of them will tell you the first wonderment, the first inspiration for their careers came to them through reading Ray Bradbury. And a lot of them say it's the golden apples of the sun, which makes no sense in space science whatsoever.
No, his lack of interest in science, it surprised me in reading the first volume of your biography, Becoming Ray Bradbury, that he apparently did pretty well in high school in science, but he just more or less lost interest in it as he became more interested in writing. The question I'm interested in is that all of us talked about beginning, and I, like Kelly, began with The Illustrated Man and went on to The October Country, which remains my favorite of his books, maybe because it's the creepiest of his books. But none of us mentioned the two classics that everybody always mentions, the Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451. When did we encounter those? We'll go back to you again, Connie.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was reading, I was doing some research today and found a picture of the tombstone of Ray Bradbury, which says the author of Fahrenheit 451. And I was like, I don't know that I'd put that on his tombstone as his, I mean, I know it's his most famous book. I know it's the one with the lasting, you cannot be on the internet for 10 minutes without encountering that in one form or another, usually somebody trying to burn it, which is the ultimate irony. But actually, I think for me, the most influential story he had was A Sound of Thunder, which is his story about the man who goes into the distant prehistoric past and steps on a butterfly and changes the world forever. And that, I think, you know, it infuses everything. The butterfly effect infuses
Yeah.
all of our thoughts about chaos theory and how the world really works. And I think he was influential in just a number of ways. And I think the problem with Fahrenheit 451 is it's like almost too famous. So people talk about it all the time and you're like, how many of you have actually read it recently? You know, I mean, it's because it is an amazing book, but at the same time, it's become just a touchstone rather than something
Yeah.
that people actually read. And for me, I loved reading it, but I was much more influenced by reading something. This was Wicked This Way Comes. I love The October Country too. I love Dandelion Wine and the Martian Chronicles. I loved all the connected stories, but I basically love all of Bradbury.
Well, I want to
But,
come back to Fahrenheit 451, but Kelly, since Connie has already mentioned 2 or 3 stories that she liked, okay, am I on better than Fahrenheit 451? What stories really changed your view of life in that sense?
You know, I maybe better to say they formed my view of life in the
Okay.
sense that I was reading them fairly young. I you know, I did love the Martian Chronicles. I think I read that pretty soon. Once I found one Bradbury collection, I looked for them all. I do love his short stories and the sort of the fix-up novels more than the straightforward novels, I think, because I love short stories best of all. But the Third Expedition is a story that has really stuck with me. And just to mention 2 others, The Fox in the Forest, or The Fox in the Forest, about the married couple who sort of fled the future. I love that story. I think about it several times a year, even when I'm not rereading Bradbury. And I love the stories about the Elliot family. I love Homecoming. I think that one really
Homecoming.
struck
Yes.
me when I was a kid. Just that combination of I guess comfort, but also this sort of wrenching realization that you will not be alive forever, that things will go on without you. But I love The Small Assassin. I've taught Bradbury a couple of times when I've gotten to teach literature or workshops, and he is still an extraordinarily effective writer to teach, in the sense that classes are often almost confused by the fact that stories are so much fun that it is very difficult to think, well, am I supposed, I love this story. Do we actually get to talk seriously about it? Can it be talked about as a piece of literature? I think because he is such an engaging writer, that you just sort of float along the surface, and it is difficult to think sometimes about all of the work, the sort of extraordinary work that goes into making those stories what they are.
John? I mean, you've taught Bradbury for decades. Are there stories that work better than any others?
Yes, there are a number of them, fortunately, that work very well. The time travel stories, like we've already
Sound of Thunder
talked about here, you know, Sound of Thunder, and also the time travel story in the Illustrated Man. Those talk a lot about consequences. And this is an author who had a hard time starting out when he was young, because he imitated people. He imitated his loves. He imitated the writers he loved. And then he found out, he figured out, with the gentle help of some of his mentors, who were also famous writers, a little older than he was, that the best thing he could write from was from his own experience, his own imagination, which focused on the hopes and fears, the terrors and the beauties, the loves and the hates of childhood as they then translate into our adult lives. And the things that are really important in life begin to come out in these stories. And that would include stories that have a very strong emotional core in them. like A Sound of Thunder, and like To the Future was the original name of the one in the Illustrated Man. And what we see there is a writer who knew that he didn't want to read tragedies in the harsh, realistic sense that show you how to die. He wanted to read tragedies that taught us how to live.
I tend to agree with that. Last night I was just happened to be rereading stories, and one of the ones that I reread was one called The Foghorn, which is widely known now as the source of a not very good science fiction movie from the 50s, I guess. But the story itself is an evocation of just absolute loneliness. The idea of two people in a lighthouse on the coast with a foghorn that attracts some kind of dinosaur, which again, in Bradbury's complete disinterest in realistic science, has been waiting under the sea for a million years.
Somebody.
But the thing is, it works emotionally. And one other point I wanted to make about the Martian Chronicles, not the Martian Chronicles, but Fahrenheit 451, is some of Bradbury seems to have cycled around to become more relevant than it seemed 20 or 30 years ago.
Right.
I mean,
True.
okay, now we're talking about banning books. I didn't think we'd be talking about these days. And the most absurd thing I thought in Fahrenheit 451 was something called The Mechanical Hound. I thought that was a complete joke. It doesn't work as science fiction until I saw the Massachusetts State Police buy one. They have one. New York is using a mechanical hound now. So suddenly things that seemed silly only a few years after Bradbury published them are actually happening. And yet nobody talks about him as a prophet, do they?
I think one of the things about Bradbury is that he puts there is sometimes science in his stories, but that's not what he's interested in. It's not that he's abandoned science. He just moved it to the background, which I think was a major part of science fiction moving into the literary mainstream. And put not the science itself, because many of those early stories were just about how to invent a rocket ship or how to invent something, with no interesting characters. And instead, he was like, what is the impact of this on people? And what are the consequences of living in a technological world, or a world in which we've invented these things, or a world in which we have to deal with once again, the consequences of what we have made of the world. And I think he was always, there's always an emotional heart. When you talk about Bradbury, you're always talking about, the way it made me feel, that the horror of the little girl locked in the closet during the one day of sunshine on Venus, or The Homecoming is one of my two favorite Bradbury stories. And because it is just so terrible. I mean, it has the sadness of not, you hope for a happy, you want the kid to be accepted. He is accepted. He is loved. But nobody can fix the fact that he's different. And nobody can fix the fact that he has a different fate from everybody else in his family. And so he's always dealing with really sad and melancholy and lonely feelings, which I think really tear the heart out of you when you're reading it as a kid, and then tear the heart out of you in a different way when you're an adult.
I think one of the things that we chatted a little bit before this, that a lot of us have this sense that you fall in love with Bradbury when you're young, when you're beginning to read, and then you think you outgrow him, and then decades later it turns out, well, wait a minute, this is not the way I remembered it. And some of the stories we've mentioned already, the idea that childhood is a period of innocence. But you're right, it's a period of great sadness in the Homecoming stories, which, and again, I learned from John's book, there actually was an Uncle Einar and an Aunt Neva. So very autobiographical. On the other hand, the romanticized childhood that we thought we were reading about isn't there when you go back now. I mean, his view of childhood was much darker than I thought it was.
Yeah.
You've got The Small Assassin, I think Kelly mentioned that earlier. You've got a baby that assassinates a family. Zero Hour is
0 Hour. Yes.
kids help aliens take over the world.
Peekaboo. Yeah. Yeah.
But so was he really at heart in some ways a horror writer?
I think that he encompasses a lot of things. But I have always thought of him as someone like Guillermo del Toro, who has a boundless enthusiasm for a monster, and who is generous in his ability to communicate to an audience that love and the stories, the horror stories, the stories about monsters have a real kind of propulsive energy to them. But he also, I think he loved coming up with imagining different worlds, imagining and not just once, all of these novels made up, the fix-up novels made up of linked stories. The initial impulse seems to have been such a generative one, that where one writer might get one story, he gets half a dozen at least.
John, I wanted to ask you about the idea of putting stories together in the Martian Chronicles, because I gather that was not originally Bradbury's idea, but rather Walter Bradbury, who was not related to him at all.
Yes, Ray Bradbury had a natural ability to spit out in a couple of hours a highly emotional story built around a central idea, and he could do it with metaphor-rich lyrical prose. It was harder for him to build larger blocks of prose, like it was for Mark Twain, who has to work through books like Roughing It and Life on the Mississippi before he can finally write a novel. And for a while, it looked like Ray Bradbury was going to be like Edgar Allan Poe, master of the short story, but not the novel form, until he gets to Something Wicked This Way Comes and some late life novels. So the Martian Chronicles was a challenge for him to put together. Walt Bradbury had suggested, the story collections aren't going to sell right now in the market very well unless you're already established as a mainstream short story writer, but you have a half cousin to a novel here in all of these Martian stories, put them together. So he put them together around, again, as we see in Fahrenheit, where you have inversions of the real world, firemen who burn things instead of saving things. The story he is extrapolating in a very H.G. Wells kind of way about when we go to Mars, what will we be? What will we do? So he puts together some variations on contact, variations on colonization and settlement, variations on then abandonment. And there you have the 17 stories and the 11 bridges then that he builds in. One reason John Steinbeck liked the Martian Chronicles, he wasn't big on science fiction, but he liked the way it was built with these interludes, as was his own Grapes of Wrath, for instance. So it all came together in that summer of 1949 as he pulled those stories together and began to bridge them, published in May of 1950, and the rest is history.
Some of the stories dealt with issues that were unusual for science fiction to deal with in the late 40s, like racism, for example, like Way in the Middle of the Air and that sort of thing.
Right.
And when I mentioned earlier that sometimes Bradbury seems more relevant, like Fahrenheit 451 is more relevant than 10 years ago, Bradbury was writing anti-colonial science fiction, and now colonialism is a big controversial issue. And one of the things that I think confused me as I was growing up with Bradbury is that here's somebody who was extremely critical of colonizing another planet and essentially wiping out its native population, who later became the champion of the space program and writing articles for Life magazine and becoming the kind of hero of the space age. And that kind of contradiction always fascinated me. Maybe it's not a contradiction. Did it bother anybody else?
Yeah, I always, this will sound terrible, but I feel like Ray Bradbury followed the first rule of science fiction, according to Jack Williams. Jack Williams had said the one thing that it was essential to have to be a science fiction writer was to have a sense of wonder, and a wonder for a love of the whole universe, a sense of wonder about space travel, a sense of wonder about the magical things that you could see on Earth, just a sense of wonder, which is, according to Jack, was the thing that you lost first. And the thing that differentiated adults from children is that children have it in spades, and then adults somehow have forgotten all about it. And I've always felt in that sense that Bradbury retained that childlike, aspect to his writing, and in the most positive sense, not in an immature way at all, just that childlike sense of wonder. And you can see it the space program was a dream come true for every science fiction writer. And I can remember the moon landing. I was more in love with the idea of actually getting to physically see Heinlein and Arthur Clarke and Ray Bradbury on television than anything else. I was basically just worried about the moon landing itself, but I was just overjoyed to see all these. It was the dream come true of every nerdy science fiction kid in the world. So that doesn't surprise me that he could embrace both those things in his life.
And you saw Ray Bradbury being broadcast from London because he was there with his family on vacation.
Oh, I didn't know that.
For me, my college days at the Air Force Academy were exactly during the 39 months that we sent human beings out of low Earth orbit. That has never been done again. And Bradbury championed all of his career, not so much to go out and conquer the universe, as to bring life out into the universe. And he saw the moon and Mars as the first steps to do that. And that was a dream. He never lost that dream. He thought that would unite us economically, politically. He was all his life against intolerance. It was against dictatorships. And he thought that the space program would be a way to let us rise above our own shortcomings as human beings.
But at the same time, he was, I'm sorry. I was just going to say he also had a very realistic image or view of what space travel would be like. One of my favorite stories is, I think it's called Kaleidoscope, although when I looked it up, that is not what I remembered the title as being, but it's the one where the space, it's an Apollo 13, only it goes terribly wrong. And that's the kind of story nobody else was writing either. They were either writing these gung-ho, soldiers in space kind of stories, or they were writing and how we were just going to go out and colonize or whatever. But they didn't really deal with all the problems and the dangers that were inherent in the space program. And I think he always saw that. And that's one of my favorite stories too. So
I was just thinking about that story too, and about not just that it's not a problem-solving story, it's a problem that can't be solved.
Right.
But the psychological realism where the men, as they're sort of shooting off in the different directions, have these, say these things to each other, terrible things, and then reconciliatory things. And it's, I think when I was a kid and I read that, he was not, the science part of the science fiction was not always terribly scientific, but the psychological realism was always right on the mark. So even as a kid, I read his stories and I thought, this really feels like people in a way that a lot of other science fiction was more scientific.
Was struggling.
We have a comment coming in from Michael Hoffman, in which he says that some of us have touched upon the theme of loneliness in so many Bradbury stories. And it strikes me that Kaleidoscope is a story that tells you, in the end, you will die alone. You will be out there. And it's interesting that somebody who could write such depressing stories retained so much love among his readers over the decades.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, he's certainly, you were talking about how he affects you, and Kelly was talking about how she thinks about stories. He stays with us, and Kaleidoscope is one of those stories changed forever. My feelings every time I see a falling star, a shooting star. I know they're meteors. I know they're meteors, but I still, you know, there's always, that story is always with me. And every time I see Jurassic Park or any dinosaur thing that they're doing, I immediately think of Sound of Thunder. I mean, the stories have a lasting impact, and that's because they're true. I think the emotional core, like Kelly says, is absolutely true. Whatever imaginative or made up story he's telling you, there's a psychological truth at the heart of it.
One of the questions we had that came in earlier, and I don't want to go entirely to the questions, but this is an interesting one because it came to us from Andy Duncan, who is a Frostburg, Maryland, an excellent short story writer himself. He's been teaching at a Clarion workshop, and he wants to know which Bradbury is most effective, or what can Bradbury say to young aspiring writers wanting to learn how to write science fiction, fantasy, horror, magic realism. All these fantastic genres are sort of mixed up now. What does Bradbury say to new writers?
I think he says, you know, write with your heart, write with sort of unashamed, unabashed, boundless love for the thing, or with interest for the things that you are interested in. That you know, he's not I'm not trying to say that he's a simple writer, but his enthusiasm, that sort of that incredible, passionate, sort of propulsive quality to his work. You know, the science in a story can be very silly, but if the energy is there, and if the characters feel like characters that you care about, the story will still move people.
You know, Jessamine West, the great author of The Friendly Persuasion, was a good friend of his, and she said Ray Bradbury was the first writer to put real human beings on the planet Mars. Real emotions. And what he would often teach young writers, he taught many little ideas from his own experience, but he would say, if you write a true story, a story that is emotionally true and not self-consciously crafted, but just sort of wells up from your subconscious, then you have a style. You automatically have a style.
Right. Right. It's true. And I would like, Andy needs to tell his kids, if he doesn't, if they don't know about it, that Bradbury wrote a wonderful book on writing called The Zen and the Art of Writing. And it's not a craft book at all, but it definitely captures that attitude. And I wanted to read a quote from the man himself. Write what you love, write only what you love, and love what you write, which I think sums up exactly. I think he definitely did that. Of course, that's not very practical advice. I mean, it'd be way easier if he had a formula for how you could do a great story. But
I do think that you have to train yourself to recognize the things that you love.
I agree.
So that actually takes some work, but that is work you have to do if you want to keep on writing.
Yeah.
Well, John, I think in your biography, there's a story, which I'd heard about earlier, that Bradbury said he burned 1 million words of his early prose at some point, when I think the story he recognized was the lake. And he suddenly realized, this is what I know how to do. And the lake is another very depressing story about a boy whose girlfriend died in, I assume, Lake Michigan, because it would have been Waukegan, years earlier. But was that his discovery of himself as a writer, do you think, John?
Yeah, I do. He always measured out milestones like that in his life. The first time I felt alive, and that's in the beginning of Dandelion Wine, right? The first time I understood what death was, you know. Remember, only 2 of the 4 Bradbury children survived. 2 died by influenza. But what he is doing with stories like, well, okay, you mentioned the 1 million words being burned. He told Jack Williamson that in a letter back in 1941, as a matter of fact. But he also said he had another 1 million words ready
to go.
ready to go. But The Lake was a milestone for his genre writing. Of course, he's more successful in the weirds first with his off-trail weirds, then more successful with science fiction. And he said that story, The Lake, written in 1944, is 44, is when I realized that I could write universally relevant fiction. Just like at about the same time, maybe a year earlier, he realized that R is for Rocket was his first quality science fiction story. So those two stories are intertwined, but the more universal story is The Lake.
Well, and one of the things that I think was fascinating about that period is that he also did something which a lot of science fiction writers wanted to know how to do, and I suspect young writers did too. He was selling early pulp magazine stories, but he was selling to the Saturday Evening Post and Mademoiselle and mainstream by the end of the 1940s. And that's when he realized that he wasn't, I guess, channeled into one genre or one subgenre. He wasn't just a pulp writer. He wasn't just a science fiction writer. He was all over the map. That seems to me to be a challenge for any writer, because I've known any number of science fiction writers who spent their entire careers trying to get out of the trap. And they all look at Bradbury and say, how did he do it when he was like 22 years old or something?
Part of that, it's a different publishing landscape, that there used to be much more of an established sort of recognized market for short stories. I remember the agent for a writer whom I love, Joan Aiken, saying that when they tried to sell her first novel, publishers came back and said, couldn't she give us a collection instead? That
oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my upside down world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have another question here from Seb Hitchcock. It was an earlier question about the space program, which has to do with how do you square his generally pessimistic view, his dystopian view in his fiction, with all the optimistic promotion of the future in his public life. And I know, again, John, going back to the Bradbury Unbound, which you're dealing with Bradbury as a celebrity, as a kind of spokesperson for the future. Is there a contradiction between, on the one hand, the future of the pedestrian or the future of Fahrenheit 451 and the future he promoted in his public life?
Well, he considered the whole range of possibilities for humanity. And he, fundamentally, and from an early time in life, he felt that it's not science that needs to be distrusted. It's the people who control science. Okay. And he, like Aldous Huxley, implicitly went to the ancient question that Juvenal gives us from ancient Rome: who watches the watchers? And we hear that question a lot in the technological and post-technological age, I suppose we're approaching. And that, made him always believe that human beings were the key. Human beings were the key. And if you went out to do your job every day, the one thing he took from Albert Schweitzer, the great doctor, philosopher of the mid-20th century, was do your work every day, and you will find meaning, and you will give other people meaning in their lives.
Doesn't that sound awfully idealistic?
But
maybe he was an idealist, wasn't he?
I think he was an idealist. I think that he had, I go back to that sense of wonder. My all-time favorite Bradbury story. I have I have like 800 second place stories. And then I have one that is absolutely my all-time favorite. And that is A Miracle of Rare Device. And that's a story about two down and outers who see a mirage on somewhere in the desert Southwest. And they decide to sell tickets to it. You can only see this mirage from a certain place. And so they sell tickets to it, and then the bad guys come along and try to make it into a commercial enterprise and stuff. But anyway, the thing is that people don't see the same thing. One person sees
Mhm.
Paris, one person sees New York, somebody sees Xanadu. You see what you bring to it yourself. And I think that's what he believed in. I think he believed in the spirit of people. He also he was also a realist in that he said, there are people who can't see it. There are people who just plain, they'll look and there won't be anything there because they just don't have the right attitude and the right humanity to them. And that's a theme that he carries on in lots of stories. I mean, the story of the man, in which the astronauts land on a planet only to find, they think that Jesus has been there and just left, and then they spend the rest of their lives traipsing after him. And but unable to find him because of who they are. And I think he's always saying who you are is really, really important, and what the future is like is totally dependent on who we are. And so I think that's both a very realistic and a very idealistic attitude. I'm sorry for the spoilers about that story for people.
Oh, that's okay. He gives you that whole range of humanity in the Martian Chronicles stories, though, doesn't he?
Yes.
Because he is absolutely certain that Mars will not be a jewel to grab and hold. Mars is a mirror.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it was very much a recreation of the American frontier experience, including essentially the equivalent of smallpox. We do have a question. We've been talking mostly about the classic period from roughly, let's say 1950 with the Martian Chronicles to 1962 with Something Wicked This Way Comes. And a lot of people have said that's the core Bradbury. That's what you have to read. And we did have a question from Dean Stickrod asking what would be a good place to start? What Bradbury stories should you begin with if you've never read a Bradbury story? And if you've never read a Bradbury story, what's wrong with you? But where would you, okay, Connie, you've already said A Miracle of Rare Device, which is an interesting choice.
That's just my favorite all time.
Okay, Kelly, do you have an all-time favorite? Or
I think I come back to The Fox in the Forest and the Third Expedition.
what was the original title of the Third Expedition, John?
Oh, that was Mars is Heaven.
Mars is Heaven, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, Kelly, I saw in an interview once, you said that part of what's so powerful about this, and I think to some extent you reflected this in your own story, Two Houses, is that somebody goes to another planet and they find their hometown, that you see your past reflected wherever you go, except of course it turns out to be a trick, but that's nevertheless, it's kind of a hypnotic idea. And I think that idea was recycled. It seemed to me endless versions of it were recycled in shows like The Twilight Zone. So it seems to me to be a really powerful thing.
And most recently, I went to Meow Wolfe in, the art installation in Santa Fe. And I don't know about the other Meow Wolves, but the original Meow Wolfe has that house. That is the entry point of that entire universe. And I took one look, and everybody was like, "Oh, look, it's an old house in a idyllic neighborhood." And I'm like, "No, wait,
don't go in it.
Don't go in. I know that house. I know what that house is." And obviously, and I'm sure, I have no idea if the Meow Wolf people intended that to be a reference to the Bradbury story, but everybody who's read Bradbury is a little nervous about going in that house. So
you mentioned the foghorn, and Kelly, thanks for reminding me that Fox in the Forest was the actual volume name of the time travel story in the Illustrated Man. But the foghorn is got that storytelling core that is Ray Bradbury. A guy who can sound like Shakespeare and the Old Testament in the same story. That's the story that convinces Hollywood director John Huston to get Ray Bradbury to write the script for the Warner Brothers version of Moby Dick, the film.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. One of the things that to me always shines through his stories is his love of books and his love of literature. The Fugitives is another favorite of mine, about the extinction of books, it's not a book burning, but it's an extinction of books and what that means to the extinction of the imagination. But all of his books, Golden Apples of the Sun, one of the reasons I was attracted to that story was I recognized the Yeats poem in it. And, you know, and that was one thing, I think that's shared by all science fiction writers. They all love books, and science fiction is nothing if not, it can't be accepted as literary fiction, but it's actually quite literary in that there are constant references to other stories and Greek myths and Oedipus and all kinds of things, because all of the people who are writing science fiction adore books and love, you know, all forms of literature. And I think he certainly had that love of literature.
That reminds me of another story, which is related exactly to what you're saying. We've talked about censorship and Fahrenheit 451. One of his oddest stories is probably The Exiles, which I believe was not in the Martian Chronicles, but in the Illustrated
Yes,
Man.
that's the story. I'm sorry. That's the story I meant. The Exile. I called it The Fugitives. I don't know why I thought it was called that. But yes, The Exile.
But yeah, Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Dickens, and they're all exiled on Mars. And as I recall the conceit, if the last one of their books is burned, they will disappear from the universe.
Yes, yes.
And it's by contemporary standards, that's absurdist. I mean, that's completely a fable. And yet it's really haunting. It somehow works. And it also is amusing because one of the things we haven't talked about is Bradbury's humor, but you've got Hawthorne and Bierce and Algernon Blackwood all worrying about the burning of their books back on Earth. And Charles Dickens doesn't want to be part of the group. He said, I want one ghost story. What's wrong with you?
Right.
You know, yeah, they're, except for Dickens, they're all the dark writers. Poe's the ringleader who wants to destroy the ship from Earth. But Bradbury's idea about his fear for the death of the imagination through censorship, it starts with the horror and supernatural fiction. And the stories like The Exiles is a perfect example of how that broadens out a few stories later into what will become Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
We do have one question, and we've got only a few minutes left. Something we haven't touched upon. Both Michael Plato asks about his late fiction, and we have Dean Stickrod. No, that's Dwayne Swarzynski saying, "What do we think about later fictions like his mystery novels, Death is a Lonely Business?" I think the other one was Graveyard for Lunatics.
That's right.
Very autobiographical novels toward the end of his career. And I don't know if we've all read them. I read them years ago. And my sense was that this tells us a lot about what it was like to be Bradbury in Venice back in the 40s. But John, you must be familiar with these. You've talked about them.
Yes, indeed. When I first met him, he was reading proofs for Graveyard for Lunatics, the second one. And the third one was Let's All Kill Constance. This was his form of autobiography. He never wrote according to the rules of any genre.
No.
He just didn't want to be pinned down that way. And he didn't want to pin down his own subconscious mind or his own creativity that way. So what he's doing here, he's having the young writer in the late 40s, as you say, Gary, and then again later in the late 50s when he's in the studios as a writer sometimes, writing murder mysteries that reveal his own life just as an autobiography would, but in a completely new and experimental way for Bradbury. And so they have that value. And it also was finally the proof that he could write sustained long fiction without having to have an initial story as an anchor point.
And he'd written the, I guess, memoir novel about working with John Huston in Ireland on Moby Dick, which is white whale. I can never remember the colors.
Green and white.
Green Shadows, White Whale, yeah.
Okay, fine.
It's supposed to be like White Hunter, Black Heart.
Right.
About John Huston.
Or like White Cat, Black Dog, I think, which is Kelly's new. Am I right about that? People who have multiple colors in titles always confuse me. I'm sorry.
I did love that book when I read it.
But we're running down to our last 5 or 6 minutes. We have had a question about his late fiction. What have we not said? What do any of you want to say that we really need to cover before we stop this? That you should always start with, okay, my recommendation is I would say people should start with The October Country. It's my personal favorite of his books. It's kind of the definitive, I think, collection of his darker stories. And a lot of the autobiographical material is there. As we mentioned, there's a real Uncle Einar, there's a real Aunt Neva. His father was a lineman. His father worked at a powerhouse. So there's a lot of his life in that. And I find those, and every time I think about October now, I think about Bradbury. He owns October.
Well, just as Poe was called the October Man in his day, Bradbury was called the October Man, and he's given us the Halloween tree, which you see in decorations now all around the country. His juvenile novel from the early 70s and eventually an animated film.
Yeah.
And so, okay, we would recommend, so nobody's disagreeing with me, The October
No,
Country
I would recommend something like It This Way Comes, which is, to me, I know it's a novel, but it's also constructed like a series of short stories. Because when you think of it in discrete pieces, you think of the carousel and you think of the Hall of Mirrors and you think of the scene in the library, which is the scariest scene ever written. And you think of all these different, parts of it. And it's just purely lovely. It's a lovely book. So that's what
you also have the two Ray Bradburys. You have Bradbury splitting himself as the two main characters, the dark and the light Bradbury.
Right.
So I've always thought that's largely an underrated novel, partly because I think when it came out, it looked to a lot of us who had read Charles Finney's The Circus of Dr. Lau, it looked like a tribute to Charles Finney. But it's very much a Bradbury novel in all of its themes. So I think you're right about that. I think we're about out of time. We're down to our last couple of minutes. And I would like to thank everybody here for having joined us. I know that for those of us talking, we could go on for another hour easily and barely scratch the surface of things.
Right.
But it's been great fun. And I think Max is back with us now. So I'll turn it over to Max.
Thanks, Gary. And thank you all. That was terrific. And I hope you've been noticing the ecstatic comments in the Q&A. You've been listening to Connie Willis, Kelly Link, Gary Wolfe, and John Eller discuss the enduring genius of Ray Bradbury. His novels and stories are published in 2 Library of America volumes, numbers 347 and 360 in the series, edited by John Eller. Information about the Bradbury volumes and links to purchase them and other editions of Great American Writing can be found on our website, LOA.org, where you'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. This program concludes LOA Live's Spring-Summer 2023 season. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us. LOA Live brings the experience of Great American Writing to readers in every state and 73 countries and territories around the globe. If you'd like to make a contribution to support this free programming, please follow the link in the chat or go to LOA.org/support. We'll be back in the fall with more programs inspired by LOA volumes that bring gifted American writers, literary scholars, and historians directly to you. In September, we take a deep dive into the persistent power of The Great Gatsby with acclaimed novelist Min-Jin Lee, New York Times critic at large Wesley Morris, and Fitzgerald scholar and editor of the Library of America Fitzgerald Edition, James West. I hope you'll join us. Check our website, LOA.org, for details on this and other fall programs. Till then, thanks 1,000 times to our panel for tonight, and thanks again to all of you for coming. Have a great evening and have a great rest of the summer.